right, so lesson on I. So I
You mean me?
is, shut up, Taylor. I is the square root of -1. That is what I is. This is also, remember, this is also I to the 1, right? But we don't write the 1 exponent if we don't need to. So I squared. I squared is the same thing as square root of 1, square root of -1 times square root of -1, which is square root of -1 squared. Those cancel, so we are left with just -1. I really hope you saw all that shit. I to the third. I to the third is -1 times square root of -1, which is negative square root of -1, which is the same thing as -I. I to the fourth. I to the fourth is -I times square root of let's back up. Same thing as negative square root of -1 times the square root of -1. Again, these become negative square root of -1 squared. These cancel, so we are left with -1, which is the same thing as 1. So we have just proved what I through I to the fourth are. So let's go to, so I'm just going to rewrite this. So we know these. Something to notice, the odd powers are still that I, or that square roots. The even powers are just -1 and 1. So what's I to the fifth? Well, I to the fifth is going to be 1 times the square root of -1, or just the square root of -1, or just I. I to the sixth, that's going to be I times square root of -1, which is, oh, right. This is the same thing as square root of -1 times square root of -1. From the previous examples, we know that those square roots are going to cancel each other out. And so this just becomes I to the sixth is -1. I to the seventh is -1 times the square root of -1, or negative root 1, or -I. So I'm going to clean this up a little bit. We've seen what I to the fifth, sixth, and seventh are. So I'm going to clean this up. Just because it's going to look nicer, and you'll see why I do this. At least I hope you do. So if we want to find out what I to the eighth is, well, do you see any, well, I mean, this is technically equal to, this is still equal to I, right? Do you see a pattern here? What should I to the eighth be? No, I'm going to stay here. I'm going to let you figure it out. Come on. Let me know. I to the eighth would be 1. I to the ninth is following that same pattern. What's I to the 11th?